Welcome to Scott's Shelf, book reviews, some of the books that have impacted my life the most. So today we're going to talk about Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So this is a book on decision psychology, and Daniel Kahneman worked with Amos Tversky for much of his career. Together they got a Nobel Prize in economics, and a lot of that was in parsing out how people make decisions. So Kahneman goes through decision psychology, and he unpacks this two-system model of thinking. So when we make decisions, he calls them system one and system two. System one is fast, it's intuitive, it wants coherence, so it wants everything that we know to fit together into a neat story. System two is more slow, more effortful, more deliberate. If you imagine, say, doing a complicated math problem like 13 times 78, system two has to answer that. We don't have a fast, intuitive answer for that type of problem. So he divides our mental operations into these two systems. System one, fast, intuitive, seeking coherence. System two, more slow, effortful, deliberative, but strong at making calculations. He contrasts how these two systems interplay within us, and it highlights why we make certain mistakes in judgment and decision. So who could benefit? Well, one, anybody whose job is to make a rational prediction. So if you're an investor, stock trader, if you're a leader and you're deciding the path for a company or a sports team, if you're a coach and your job is to help people make those types of decisions or guide the performance of a group of people, you could benefit from thinking fast and slow so that you understand the ways that we're likely to make mistakes and errors as we're making decisions. Second group of people, if you're a high stakes performer. So if you work in sales or sports or you're in the service and there are potentially very negative consequences to your decisions, it's worth knowing how you make those decisions. So I had a lot of takeaways from Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a large book. There's a ton packed into it, and I had to reread a couple of sections to make sure I was getting these ideas down pat. I look forward to reading it again in a couple of years and getting an even deeper grasp of some of the concepts Kahneman is highlighting here. So one set of takeaways was around the idea of rational decision making. And so the economics that I've read in the background previous to this book has tended to assume that people make rational decisions, with the one exception of Freakonomics. That gets into a little more of the gray area of like how things can go wrong or how they can go fantastically. But here, Kahneman highlights the basic assumptions of economists versus the basic assumptions of psychologists. And he talks about how that interplay, especially as he was working with some economists, how that developed his ability to parse out these system one and system two aspects of our decision-making ability. He highlights that in Econs versus Humans. So when he talks about people making very rational predictions and decisions and not letting intuitive judgments or biases get in the way, he talks about those folks as econs, and they're mythical. We're humans, and so we've got system one operating as well, where we make fast, intuitive judgments and have some of the biases and trade-offs that making fast, intuitive judgments bring along with them. So system one versus system two, he highlights a series of different effects, assumptions, strengths and weaknesses between system one and system two. And we can go through a few of those. So one is priming. So if I ask you to look at a piece of paper and it has the number 178 written on it, then I ask you to estimate Gandhi's age, you'll write down a certain number. If I give another group of people a piece of paper that has the number 17 on it, and then ask them to estimate Gandhi's age when he died, they'll write down a different set of numbers, much lower. So that's an illustration of the priming effect. So whatever decision we're making right now, whatever's come immediately before that has an influence on system one. And system one will make snap judgments, just drawing from wherever's easiest. And so whatever just happened before is an easy place to go to in memory to pull a number. So you know that Gandhi lived more than 17 and less than 178, and yet it'll still guide your estimate for when you think Gandhi died. So that's priming. Whatever came right before is influencing our current decision. Second is what you see is all there is. So this is system one's tendency to want a coherent story. And as soon as it gets enough facts that fit and it can make a story, bam, it's like, doesn't need any more information. It's time to go to town, make the decision, do the next thing. And so this blinds us to other possibilities. So system two has a tendency, if we can enable it, to seek gaps in our knowledge. System one does not. System one is happy as long as there's a coherent structure there. Next up is narrow framing. And so that's, again, failure to consider outside information. And so we can have blinders on and stay within a certain context, and that lets us make rapid decisions, but it leaves out a bunch of information. So if we have that narrow frame, we won't consider certain types of obstacles that may happen in the future. We won't consider certain types of opportunities. We're bounding ourselves and keeping our context unnecessarily small. A tweak on that is the idea of the inside view. So this is really interesting. We prioritize our subjective experience over statistical data. And system one draws from the easiest forms of memory. And those are our subjective experiences, things that have made an impact on us. So he has a wonderful story about a group of experts that were brought together to create a textbook. And he had everybody estimate, how long do you think this is going to take? And so they all wrote down their estimates, and they were all like a year and a half, 2 years, somewhere in that area. And then he realized one of the people had been on textbook creation teams in the past. And so he asked, hey, how did that go? They all took between 4 and 7 years, and some teams didn't even come up with a textbook. They just abandoned the project. And yet, even knowing that, that expert had also estimated like a year and a half to 2 years. So that's the inside view, is a preference for our own subjective experience and our own subjective abilities, and giving weight to our gut feelings about things over statistical evidence. So if we can ask for outside statistics, the outside view, like how have other people done this, then that can give us a broader picture and a more complete set of facts in order to make decisions. Preference reversals. This is a little bit complicated, but basically you can present the same exact fact pattern in 2 different ways. So if you give us 2 different stories, like from different starting points. One example of this is, would you rather flip a coin and earn $100 or earn nothing? Versus, I give you $100 and you flip a coin and you either get to keep it or you have to give it back. And we have different reactions to our willingness to take that bet in those situations, whether we're going to win $100 that we don't have, or whether we're going to lose $100 that we've just been given. So that difference between willingness to accept a gamble towards a gain and our unwillingness to accept the same gamble towards the same size loss is an example of a preference reversal. And it's tied in that case also to our loss aversion. So interesting way that we're framed up to prioritize negative consequences, negative information, negative outcomes. We become loss averse and thus risk averse. So those are some interesting ways in which we can treat similar, the same identical situation, the same identical decision, differently. And that's because of the preference reversals that system one will pull into place. Next up, substitutions. So system one uses cognitive ease as a marker for several things: coherence and truth. It substitutes those. So if I ask a really hard question, like which of the 3 candidates that we interviewed today would be best for this job, that's difficult to answer. System one doesn't want to do that. System two will do pro-con lists if I take advantage of system two and ask it to weigh advantages and disadvantages of each candidate. System one doesn't want to take the time and effort for that. So it will substitute a different question. Most likely it's going to be, which candidate did I like best of those 3? That's easy to answer. And so system one latches on to those easier questions. So this was really revealing for me because it made me go back and think about times in my life where I had made a decision and it turned out not to go the way that I wanted to. How much of that was due to my system one answering an easier question and not giving proper weight to all the data and the research that had gone before. Additionally, Kahneman offers ways to overcome some of those biases and effects of system one. And they're not always easy or simple. A lot of it was setting up systems in order to force yourself to slow down, be more effortful, more calculating in certain decision-making situations. But I think that's immensely practical. So a couple of more takeaways. One was this idea that medical and legal long shots, we have a tendency to latch on to a very small chance of success for medical procedures or for legal cases. And that's often because of this disconnect between system one and system two. In addition, the way that those odds of the good outcome versus the bad outcome are presented to us. And so there's a wonderful discussion about giving percentage chances for different outcomes versus giving like 1 in 1,000 versus 1 in 100,000 outcomes. Our system one will latch on to those differently. And so it's often a good idea to reframe using system two and put everything in the same percentage format to see what you're really dealing with here in terms of how much of a long shot is this. Second up, moral judgments are based on frames, not facts. So this blew my mind. I guess I read a lot of philosophy about utilitarianism in my undergraduate career in sense. And so the idea that we make moral judgments not on outcomes, but we need a story. So we don't look at cold sets of facts and say, okay, this situation is better than that situation. We tell a story about how we got to that set of facts, or we tell a story about the rule or operating principle that brought those two sets of facts about. That was fascinating to me. And he offers some great examples about how we come to different moral judgments depending on how a situation is framed. And it's analogous to the situation where I talked about the coin flip, and you either get to gain $100 or lose the $100 that I just gave you. So exact same situation, but we think about it differently, we feel about it differently. The same thing happens here with moral judgments. So we need to understand that when we're making moral judgments, we need to pay attention to the story that's operating. And it's not the facts that are driving the situation. So that was really interesting to me, especially in light of the intensity of discussion in a lot of political arena. I guess we'll just leave it there. Lastly, the remembering self makes the decisions. So this was interesting. Kahneman parses apart, additionally, the part of us that's experiencing things as they go on. Like if you gave part of the button and just keep pushing this button when things are like above average, great, and then stop when they're below average. You can imagine a graph coming out of that. And then that part of us that's monitoring how things are right now doesn't get a say in making decisions. It's the remembering self that looks back on like, okay, here's these sprinkled in memories from the past. I'm going to draw on those and make a decision. And it's not an average of, like, if I'm imagining a physical race, like, how did it go? How did I feel about it? Well, it was awful sometimes, and I felt good sometimes, you know, had highs and lows. But basically, it was uncomfortable. So if I compare that to, like, would I be willing to push that hard on that same race again to get the feeling of achievement of accomplishing it? My remembering self isn't going to look back over the collection of data of how that experience was going and how uncomfortable I felt across the whole race. It's going to look back at peak discomfort. So what was the worst that I felt and how did I feel at the end? And it's going to average those two. And so if I had a race where I was a fairly high level of discomfort for most of the race and then ended, you know, feeling pretty good, I'll look back, contrast that with a race where I had peaks of just awful suffering, like pushing myself really hard to go up hills fast. And then I ended like with a good time, looked up at the clock and like was really happy. So the discomfort drops. Like that may cause me to have a different willingness to take on this race versus this race. So it's the remembering self that makes the decisions. That was the take-home point there. So connections. If you're interested in Jordan Peterson's lectures, in several of the lectures, he mentions how it's his view that economics is a branch of ethics because it's dealing with value judgment. And so it's, you know, a limited scope in economics. We put the stamp of monetary value or usefulness on things, but that's like a great analogy for making value judgments in general. And so if that idea appeals to you at all, give Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman a read. Also, if you've read Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, and that's about making snap decisions and ways we can go wrong or ways we can make those more effective, Thinking Fast and Slow will give you a deeper understanding of the nuts and bolts involved there. If you've read Seligman's work on positive psychology, so Flourish, for example, that I reviewed here, I think you'd also be interested in Thinking Fast and Slow because it's, you know, Kahneman's talking about making decisions, making value judgments, and aiming at something better. And so there's a lot of overlap in the practical applications for both. And lastly, if you have read Sunstein and Thaler's Nudge, this work, Thinking Fast and Slow, will give deeper insights into the nuts and bolts of how to nudge people towards better decisions and insulate them, for example, from some of those framing effects or some of those biases that are system one. Thanks for listening. As always, if you'd like deeper discussion or more links, more resources, you can head over to Scott's Shelf on Mighty Networks, and there's the address. Also, we do occasional live book clubs via Zoom and coursework that takes a deep dive into themes that spread across books.